Hola, buenas tardes. Creo que vamos a empezar porque si no el tiempo de por sí vuela. Entonces, bueno, darles desde luego la bienvenida a todas y a todos. Hay muchas personas que están conectadas en línea y bueno, afortunadamente aquí nuestros amigos de apoyo nos pusieron una camarita, está muy bien, para que nos vean. Sí. ¿Sí se escucha, va? Sí, okay. Bien, entonces, miren, la idea de hoy es tener este taller, conversación sobre métodos mixtos, que es una aspiración del instituto, ¿no? O sea, durante mucho tiempo hemos hablado de la necesidad de desarrollar capacidad en métodos mixtos. Poco a poquito lo hemos ido logrando, pero pues ahora la intención es que esto, digamos, termine de tomar forma y que cada vez más hagamos uso de estos métodos y los integremos en el estudio de los problemas de salud pública en general. Y entonces, bueno, pues la intención es justamente aprovechar la experiencia, el conocimiento y todo lo aprendido ya por parte de nuestras colegas que van a estar impartiendo el día de hoy el taller. Yo me disculpo de antemano porque en algún momento voy a tener que salir volando, pero trataré que sea lo más tarde que se pueda. Bien, entonces quiero empezar dándole la bienvenida a la doctora Elizabeth Roberts. Ella es profesora de antropología en la Universidad de Michigan. Muy bien, Michigan, ¿cómo no? E investiga la producción de conocimiento científico y de salud pública y sus efectos incorporados en América Latina y en Estados Unidos. Actualmente colabora con ingenieros y científicos de salud ambiental en Estados Unidos y México como parte de 2 proyectos en la Ciudad de México sobre exposiciones mexicanas, un enfoque bioetnográfico de salud y desigualdad y ambientes vecinales como socio-tecno-biosistemas, que incluye calidad del agua, confianza ciudadana y salud. Es también directora del Laboratorio de Codificaciones Etnográficas de México, donde capacita a estudiantes universitarios en métodos de codificación cualitativa, utilizando materiales de sus proyectos colaborativos. Anteriormente, la doctora Roberts trabajó en reproducción asistida en Estados Unidos y Ecuador, y en gobernanza reproductiva en América Latina y en migraciones médicas transnacionales. Elizabeth, muchas gracias por acompañarnos y por dedicarnos tu tiempo, te lo agradecemos muchísimo y vamos a estar muy atentos. Y luego, bueno, Mara, que pues no necesita introducción, pero de todas maneras lo vamos a hacer, es una epidemióloga, es una fabulosa epidemióloga del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública. Su investigación se centra en los efectos a largo plazo de tóxicos ambientales, factores como estrés social, condiciones nutricionales durante la gestación y la infancia. Y bueno, Mara dirigió por muchos años la División de Estadística del Instituto, donde realizó evaluaciones de programas y encuestas nacionales. Actualmente, Mara está muy dedicada al estudio de la exposición en plomo y a tratar de influir sobre las políticas para reducir la exposición a plomo, y también, como muchas y muchos de ustedes saben, es la investigadora principal en México para las 2 cortes de nacimiento más grandes que tiene el instituto, que son Element y Progress. Entonces, bueno, Mara, también muchísimas gracias por el apoyo. Estamos muy contentos de tener este taller y bueno, pues ojalá la intención es que este sea el primero de muchos talleres donde podamos ir aumentando nuestra capacidad y nuestro conocimiento sobre métodos mixtos. Pues ahora sí ya les dejo el micrófono, mil gracias.
Gracias a ti, Tona. Hoy, pues, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Lo primero que les queremos decir es que buscamos que sea una conversación. La palabra taller no es que los vamos a poner a trabajar y que van a sacar stata y vamos a hacer análisis, no para nada. La palabra taller es porque queremos que sea una plática. Nosotros tenemos una plática planeada, pero por favor deténganos, no se llaman interrupciones, se llama conversación. O sea, la idea es que conversemos y tenemos 3 horas para conversar. No creo que nos vayamos a gastar 3 horas, pero sí el chiste es conversar, y si algo he aprendido con Lisa es el valor de conversar. Entonces, ese es como el principal objetivo, que les vamos a compartir nuestra historia y vamos a conversar. Lo segundo es que para los que somos más añosos, nuestro presentación está programada como la caricatura de Hugo, Paco y Luis. No sé si ustedes se acuerdan, los más jovencitos no saben quién era Hugo, Paco y Luis, pero así vamos a estar, o sea, yo hago un cachito y luego Lisa hace otro cachito y luego hago otro cachito, porque lo que creo que hemos construido juntas es avanzar en lo que estamos haciendo, pero les juro que ni yo sola podría presentar esto, ni Lisa creo que lo podría presentar sola, sino el chiste es ir haciendo eso, ¿no? Un cachito y un cachito, y así es como se ha ido haciendo el bucle que les queremos empezar a platicar. Y bueno, empezando como Hugo, Paco y Luis, va Lisa. Otra cosa es que el idioma oficial del taller es Spanglish. Entonces, yo voy a hablar en español, Lisa va a hablar en Spanglish y ustedes pueden hablar como quieran. Ese es el chiste, ¿no? Conversar.
Y tú vas a hacer eso, ¿sí?
Sí, es
ya,
cierto.
ya.
Yo voy a hacer
Okay.
esto. Ok, entonces, lo primero es que la conversación está organizada en 5 puntos. Primero, les vamos a empezar diciendo quiénes somos, o sea, o quiénes éramos, quiénes somos, y les vamos a platicar un poco el proyecto con el cual inició nuestra colaboración, que ahorita estamos en nuestro 10º aniversario. Les vamos a platicar, bueno, los proyectos que están atrás son las cortes. Entiendo que todo el mundo sabe mucho de las cortes, pero a lo mejor una recordadita de dónde, a qué le llamamos las cortes no estaría mal, que lo voy a hacer yo. Luego Lisa les va a contar un poco cómo empieza ella desde la etnografía y sus proyectos de bioetnografía en las cortes, y luego vamos a hablar de los retos que hemos tenido para desarrollar el trabajo en multidisciplinario. Les vamos a contar ejemplos clásicos, claves para nosotras de lo que hemos ido haciendo, y al final, la verdad es que nos gustó improvisar una reflexión de cómo hemos cambiado en estos 10 años, ¿no? Y cuáles son nuestras reflexiones que nos han llevado a esta aventura tan bonita que además ya se extiende a más, porque aquí ya tenemos otro converso, que es José Luis Figueroa, ya también está con nosotros. Entonces, adelante, Lisa, creo que tú empiezas.
Sí, pero solamente
Tú por un momento.
Ok, ¿está funcionando? Ok. Hola a todos, gracias por tenerme. Y obviamente soy Elizabeth Roberts, soy una antropóloga, medical anthropologist is what I get called in the United States. Y ahora y por los últimos años, mi interés más fuerte es para entender los vínculos entre salud y desigualdad. Y por esta razón, yo llegué hace 10 años para hablar con Mara y hicimos un montón de cosas desde este punto. Entonces, la cosa que estoy haciendo en los últimos años, creo, es una cosa que se llama, that I call outward-facing anthropology. No sé la manera para decir eso en español, pero es antropología que está en la dirección afuera, creo. En 2 maneras. Quisiera hablar más a un público, personas afuera de la universidad, pero también a otros investigadores, tipos de investigadores, como personas que están haciendo salud pública, ingenieros, ahora health economists. Y no es solo para tener los herramientas de antropología en antropología. Quisiera dar los herramientas afuera. Y también,
feel free and speak in English, no
okay,
problem.
Y también tengo mi interés en colaboración con otros tipos de gente. Ahora es Mara.
Yo soy matemática de origen, con maestría en estadística y un doctorado en epidemiología. Desde hace 20 años soy la investigadora responsable en México de las cortes Element y Progress, de las que vamos a platicar un poquito. Y bueno, algo que no dije es que nos disculpamos porque las diapositivas están en inglés, pero esto se basa en un taller que dimos en Londres hace unos poco y del cual Tona fue quien amablemente nos invitó. Pero bueno, algo que me ha interesado muchísimo es que las cortes han sido una fuente de generación de artículos científicos de alto impacto impresionante. Es impresionante. Y también de formación de recursos humanos. Pero sí fue muy pues muy duro ver cómo estábamos teniendo mucho impacto en la política pública de otros países y no lo teníamos en México. Entonces, más o menos desde hace, coincide, 10 años, empiezo a trabajar con una organización de la sociedad civil en Estados Unidos, que es Pure Earth, con quienes hemos trabajado mucho la incidencia en política pública, en particular de la exposición a plomo. Nuestra investigación va más allá de muchos tóxicos, pero incidir en política pública ha sido lo más difícil que yo he hecho en toda mi vida y por eso es que solamente escogí el plomo como una, Carlos Santos Burgoa diría, punta de lanza. Ojalá que lo sea. Entonces, dicho sea esto, thank you. Lo que nosotros les vamos a platicar se anida completamente en las Cortes Element, que empezó en 1994. Nuestro participante más grande nació el 28 de abril de 1994, tiene 29 años y ya es abuelo. No, perdón, ya es papá. Entonces, la mamá es la que es abuela, la mamá es la que es abuela. Estamos ya en la Corte tiene 3 generaciones, completamente enfocada en cuestiones ambientales, para ver efectos de la contaminación ambiental, de muchos tóxicos ambientales. Esta es la Corte Element. Cuando veamos la parte roja, el cintillo rojo refleja la parte como desde la epidemiología, el abordaje ortodoxo de la epidemiología, ¿no? Un estudio de corte, biomarcadores, pruebas psicométricas, muy numérica, bioestadística solamente, mucha biología molecular, etcétera. Luego viene el proyecto de MEXPOS, que es el de exposiciones ambientales en México, cuando Lisa y yo empezamos a trabajar juntas en 2014, y es el que tiene un enfoque etnográfico, del que obviamente Lisa es quien les va a platicar, y eso lo vamos a identificar a lo largo de la presentación con el cintillo azul, ¿no? Entonces, cuando ven en la presentación rojo es la Corte, cuando vean presentación azul, pues es ya como que está llegando Lisa, y cuando vean morado, es ya, ¿no? La combinación de rojo y azul es morado, es con los proyectos que ya tenemos desde nuestra interacción, ¿no? Ya en este maridaje de metodologías que creo que hemos ido haciendo y les vamos a contar particularmente el caso de un proyecto de agua y en un proyecto que estamos en la Ensanut, ¿no? Bueno, ¿qué es la Corte Element? Como les decía, es una corte y aquí hicimos mucho énfasis en el financiamiento, porque uno de los retos que tenemos nosotras es conseguir financiamiento. La Corte Element ha tenido prácticamente 30 años ininterrumpido de financiamiento, pero interesante, ¿no? Con un método tradicional, y es financiado principalmente por los NIH de Estados Unidos. Es un estudio donde reclutamos a mujeres embarazadas o en el parto, que empezó en 1994, y donde, como les decía, nos interesa mucho estudiar exposiciones ambientales, metales, químicos, contaminación del aire y exposiciones a través de la dieta también. Hemos estudiado, pues, cognición, obesidad, pubertad, conforme los chicos y las chicas fueron creciendo, actividad física, y tenemos cada vez más profundidad en cosas, por ejemplo, como hígado graso, ¿no? Pero a través de resonancia magnética, resonancia magnética para evaluar hígado graso. Tenemos un estudio que Belém es la investigadora responsable en México sobre salud ósea, súper sofisticado, con una metodología aquí muy acá, y hay un componente muy grande de epigenética, de metabolómica y de proteómica. Tenemos muestras biológicas de lo que se puedan imaginar y más. Uñas, cabello, orina, plasma, sangre, heces fecales, células nasales, lo que quieran. Y tenemos muestras de ambientales, agua, sal, pasta de dientes, en fin, es muy grande. Por el diseño de la Corte, actualmente empezamos como con 1,200 madres, 1,500, pero no pensamos que iba a durar tanto tiempo, o en su momento no se pensó que iba a durar tanto tiempo, y cuando ya se le vio visos de que a lo mejor esto sí podía ir para largo fue en 2008. Entonces ya había pasado un buen rato del inicio de las Cortes y ya solo pudimos regresar y contactar a 700. Actualmente nuestro número más o menos que manejamos es 700 madres que fueron las madres que reclutamos, con sus respectivas hijos o hijas, que ahorita están, les digo, el más grande tiene 29 años, la más chica debe tener como 15, y ya estamos con la tercera generación, tenemos más o menos 80 nietos, ¿no? Más o menos, por eso es que hace rato me confundí. Y como les decía, pues orgullosamente, y lo digo muy orgullosamente, pero también con mucho reconocimiento, que es una labor colaborativa de muchas instituciones, mucha gente trabajando con mucho compromiso, pues sí hemos sido muy exitosos en publicaciones y en formación de recursos humanos. Digo, sí creo que somos como 30 doctorados o más en las cortes, ¿no? No quisiera como entrar en mucho detalle, pero tenemos una combinación de la corte Element, que como les decía, no fue pensada originalmente para durar tanto tiempo, empezó siendo un ensayo clínico aleatorizado doble ciego. O sea, lo más, el estándar de oro, ¿no? De la causalidad en epidemiología. Y lo que nosotros buscábamos era evaluar el efecto de una suplementación con calcio en mujeres durante la lactancia para prevenir la movilización del plomo en hueso materno, que podría estar estimulada por la lactancia y por el embarazo, la demanda excesiva de calcio, y que le pudiera llegar al bebé, perdón, porque este ya es en la lactancia. Y pues medíamos de una manera indirecta, obviamente, plomo en hueso, en fin, no quisiera como detenerme mucho en esto, pero les quise como resumir el objetivo de la primera corte para que vean qué específica era, ¿no? Un ensayo clínico aleatorizado doble ciego para evaluar la suplementación con calcio, de algo muy, muy, muy específico. Después vino la corte 2. La corte 1, les decía que habíamos reclutado las mujeres en el embarazo, y la corte, perdón, en el parto, y hubo una suplementación durante el posparto, pero en la corte 2 queríamos entrar al embarazo. Y entonces, atreverse a tener un ensayo clínico durante el embarazo es un reto gigantesco, y entonces empezamos con un estudio observacional desde el embarazo, en donde medimos otra vez un montón de biomarcadores con el objetivo de ver desde el embarazo la movilización del plomo del hueso materno, cómo pasaba el circulante de la madre, cómo el plomo atravesaba la barrera fetoplacentaria, cómo llegaba el bebé en formación, cómo los niños estaban haciendo con plomo cuando no deberían hacer con plomo, y cuál era el efecto de largo plazo de todo lo que acabo de decir. La corte 3 lo que hace es combinar la 1 y la 2. Y entonces ahí sí, con lo que aprendimos en la 1 del ensayo aleatorizado, con lo que aprendimos en la 2 del embarazo, hicimos un ensayo clínico aleatorizado desde el embarazo en la corte 3, y con los mismos objetivos combinados, efecto de la suplementación con calcio desde el embarazo y el neurodesarrollo del niño. Todo esto ocurrió entre 1994 y 2003. Como les decía, eran 3 cortes que parecían independientes, que se siguieron más o menos por 5 años cada uno, y que parecía que pues a los 5 años ya le íbamos a poner el cerrado, ¿no? Se acabó. Luego en 2008 resulta que Howard Hu, el investigador responsable en ese momento en Estados Unidos, dice, oye, ¿y qué tal si mejor tratamos de integrar las 3 cortes y pedimos financiamiento y creamos ya una sola corte? Y así fue como nació Element en 2008, cuando en 2008 tenemos nuestro primer proyecto ya de una sola corte, y a partir de entonces todos esos cuadritos que ustedes ven son diferentes proyectos que hemos ido teniendo. Aquí quisiera mencionar NESMEX, que es el primer proyecto grande para los términos de lo que es etnografía, que tuvo 60 familias, que es el primer proyecto en donde ya estamos juntas, pero antes había visto uno solamente de etnografía que les va a platicar Lisa, que no está ahí porque ese es completamente etnográfico. Ya, gracias. Creo que ahí te toca.
Now you have to talk about me showing up.
Ya. Entonces, sí, adelante, Victoria.
A las mujeres. O sea, en esta corte, en las De
No.
1994 a 2003 o en todo el tiempo que llevan, no vieron nada infeccioso, o sea, cuando pues como los están siguiendo en el tiempo, no vieron cosas febriles y que en eso tomaran muestras, nada infeccioso.
Por supuesto, es una pregunta y es una muy buena pregunta porque la respuesta es no. No, tenemos autorreporte de enfermedad, por ejemplo, de diarrea, pero todo relevante a las exposiciones ambientales, de que por si el niño había, o también de crecimiento, por si el niño había perdido peso, pero no tenemos autorreporte de enfermedades infecciosas, pero no tenemos ningún biomarcador de enfermedades infecciosas. Si eso ayuda, sí, eso sí lo tenemos. Bueno, luego, todo esto ocurre y en 2014,
13. Sí.
13, Lisa llega a Cuernavaca, bueno, primero habla con Karen Peterson, la investigadora responsable, la nueva investigadora responsable en Michigan, y de Element, de la corte Element, y le dice que quiere hacer un estudio etnográfico en la corte. Y Karen dice, pues sí, si convences a Mara, no hay bronca. Llega Lisa a México, viene a Cuernavaca, nos vamos a comer. Y en esa comida, que no les voy a decir dónde fue porque es muy vergonzoso, fue en Los Colorines y la llevé a que viera cómo se come en barro vidrio con plomo, pero fue la última vez que comí ahí. Empezamos a platicar, le digo, oye, pero yo no sé lo que es la etnografía. O sea, ¿qué quiere decir etnografía? Y me dijo, mira, lo primero que es que es una investigación no hypothesis driven. Yo, ¿cómo? O sea, ¿no tienes una hipótesis? ¿No? O sea, yo le pregunto a los estudiantes, ¿qué dirían sus directores y de tesis cuando se haga una tesis sin hipótesis, no? Y yo decía, pero ¿cómo? ¿Y qué vas a hacer? Pues mira, tengo la intención de vivir en un año, sí, un año, en una colonia donde vivan participantes de la corte y pues voy a vivir con ellos. ¿Y dónde quieres hacer eso? En Barrio Norte. Ya había hablado con la gente, ya había identificado dónde vivían las personas, ya había decidido que quería hacerlo en Barrio Norte. Yo no sé quién de ustedes vive en Ciudad de México, conozca Ciudad de México, se ubica donde es Barrio Norte. Barrio Norte es una colonia difícil en términos de violencia, de seguridad pública, que está del periférico hacia arriba. Y no es una colonia en donde yo me sintiera cómoda de que viviera Lisa, ¿no? Y además, digo, bueno, ¿y cómo? O sea que, mira, tengo un tema, sí tenía un tema del que ella les va a platicar, pero no tengo hipótesis, voy a vivir ahí un año, ¿y cómo es tu metodología? I will hang out. ¿Eh? O sea, ¿me podrías decir qué quiere decir hanging out? Yo voy a vivir con ellos. Verdaderamente me pareció choqueante, o sea, no me podía imaginar que eso fuera ciencia, debo confesarlo, que si fui totalmente escéptica. Pues suena interesante, vamos a aprender algo que nosotros no sabemos, porque alguien que se meta a ese nivel. Pero entonces así fue como ese primer encuentro que debo confesar que fue profundamente escéptico, ¿no? Profundamente escéptico. Fue maravilloso hablar con alguien tan informado de México, pero sí, metodológicamente era un reto para entender esa metodología para mí, era un gran reto.
Gracias. I'll do most of this in English and I'll speak slowly, but if you don't understand anything, porfa, put up your hand. So, right, in the spring of 2013, 10 years ago, I came here for the first time ever on a bus to meet Mara and tried to explain to her what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do, she's already talked about, is do two things. One is I wanted to learn about how scientists like her make epidemiological knowledge. And I was very interested in that. And that's what anthropologists do often now, how scientists make knowledge, because the way we make knowledge is embedded in the worlds that we live in. You know, scientists in different places make knowledge in different ways. The other thing I wanted to do is move into 2 neighborhoods. It was actually 2, but one of them was Barrio Norte, that had a high density of element participants, so that I could learn what was important to them in their daily lives, what shaped the way they organized their day. And of course, because I was a middle-aged woman, I was mostly going to spend time with the element mothers who had been recruited early on. We were similar age. And what that meant is in each of these 2 neighborhoods that I lived for 6 months each, I recruited 3 families that were in the study. And I also lived with another family, my landlady. In both cases, they were landladies. And I got to know these 3 families, their neighbors, their relatives, and I got to know my landlady's family and their relatives and their neighbors. And I lived in these 2 neighborhoods. And what it meant was I would spend about 6 to 7 hours a week with each family, doing whatever they were doing, literally. If they were going to church, I went to church. If they were going to the Merced to buy products to bring back to their neighborhood to sell, that's what I would do. If they were cleaning the house, I would help. If they were making dinner or having a party or going to a street party, that's what I did during that time. And then the main thing you then do is go home and you write a lot of notes about it. It's very time consuming and really boring, but it's really important that you write all these notes. And what I was interested in was things like what matters to people, but my larger interest is in health and inequality. And over time, through notes and hanging out with people, you start noticing all kinds of things that matter to people. They might be things that make sense to me, and they might be things that don't make sense to me at all, because they live in a pretty different world than where I came from. So I wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of field notes. And then I finished that year. And I also spent time going to element meetings and watching what happened when the participants came in to the study and watching what it was like for them to go through a visit at La Casita, where the data is gathered, how they answered surveys about what they ate, for instance. And I learned a lot about that. And I kind of could see the ways that what people were asked about didn't always reflect their reality or what mattered to them. So I came back from that year. And at that point, I would say, even though I was getting to know Mara, I didn't really have a good way to talk to researchers like Mara. So I came back, I moved back to Michigan, and I started going to the element meetings, and I was like, I have a lot to tell you, but no one really was interested, for good reason. It wasn't their fault. I just didn't know how to speak in a language that Mara and other researchers would understand, or how, you know, I could make it so that what I knew about people's lives mattered to them. And I would say that's something that we've really developed over the last 10 years. We've learned to have more of a common language. But at first, you know, I could tell you all kinds of things. And given that they didn't know what was important, they wouldn't know how to ask me what I knew. So we're going to give you some examples of how over time we figured out what was good, how to share all of this ethnographic data. And as Mara pointed out, what I did was non-hypothesis driven. I just wrote down notes about whatever was going on. And often what ethnographers are is they're their own best tool, because it's how we notice what seems strange or what keeps happening that you start gathering a sense of what matters and how it's connected to other things in the world. And then pretty soon after I came back, Mara came to live in Ann Arbor. And that's when we really started talking a lot about the ways that what I knew about these families and what Element does could come together. And she came up with this great term, semillero, that she started to think of what my knowledge was a seed bed for creating new questions or asking questions in new ways that, you know, Element couldn't do before because they didn't have the kind of data I had. They had tons of data, great data, and maybe we could put this data together in all kinds of new ways. So it's hard to see this. When I went to Mexico, and while I was there, I had this idea that what maybe eventually we would start being able to do is something that I had called then bioethnography. And that's, I think we're still using that term. And what I mean by bioethnography, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that now or later, is to bring together two or different disciplines in a methodological way, meaning that we were going to think about a topic together, like health and inequality, and we use different methods to get at an understanding of those things. So people in Element use survey data, they gather biomarker data, they do, you know, they do all kinds of things to those biomarkers. I gather data ethnographically, but it's not, and this is very important to me, I don't know how important it is to Mara, but I feel like it's important to say that it's not about saying, I'm studying people's culture and Element is studying what's going on in their bodies. We're doing something different than that. And that way of dividing things, I think, has a long history where, oh, there's an anthropologist and she understands the culture. But I was very intent on saying that is not how we're going to combine, because what people do, what matters to them is not some cultural thing in their heads. It's about the ecology that they live in, which is shaped by, you know, government policies and multinational corporations and long-standing infrastructures. And those things shape the incidence of diabetes just as much as, you know, how people organize how they eat within families. So we're using different methods to know about health and inequality, but I'm not studying the culture and Element is studying the nature. So what bioethnography to me is a way to bring these methods together to ask stronger questions together. And in doing that, you can ask better questions, generate better data, and after the ethnographic part, you can often generate better hypotheses that are truly bioethnographic. They're coming from this understanding, a very thick understanding of people's lives that really matter within their lives. So now we're going to give you some examples. And so these are images here of, you can't really see it, but it's okay. So there's a picture up there and I'm sitting there taking field notes while a woman cooks comida, you know, and then there's blood samples. And then there's a picture of a dam, una presa con aguas negras, in one of the neighborhoods that I lived in that kind of contributes to the environment. So bioethnographic questions would basically bring all of this data together to understand what might be the right questions or really robust questions to ask about people's lives in relation to health. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about 3 bioethnographic projects that we've done together. 2 of them we're just going to talk about for a short time. And then the third one, the last one, Nesmex and Sanut, which is about water and involves Mara and Jose Luis, we're going to spend some more time on. And we have some pretty exciting data on that. So we'll talk about that. Numbers. We have numbers. We have made numbers, bioethnographic numbers now. And we've made numbers in all these projects in a way. And as I'll talk about, that's pretty strange for an anthropologist. We don't usually make numbers. So it's a new thing for me. So we're going to talk about 3 projects, one about sleep, one about eating in Mexico City. And I think probably a lot of people here are interested in nutrition, so feels relevant. And then we're going to talk about this water project. Okay, so currently we call this project the sociality of sleep, but it didn't start out that way. So I think this project is a good example about how we were finally able to figure out kind of how to talk to each other and how ethnography could be useful for generating new kinds of data and creating new hypotheses. So when I came back from living in Mexico City in Barrio Norte and in another neighborhood that is called San Nicolas in Tlalpan, I went to the meetings and kept saying, hey, I know stuff. You could ask me things, but no one did. So there was a new study that the element researchers were starting to develop about sleep. And what the initial interest was to look at, as far as I understand it, how chemical exposure potentially impacts sleep. And, we have this whole cohort to look at that, long-term biobanks, we can think about chemical exposure and we can think about sleep. And what the researchers were doing was taking a burgeoning knowledge base on sleep studies, mostly from the United States and Europe, that has all these ideas about how people should sleep and what healthy sleep is. And they were taking studies that had been validated in places like the United States, and they were going to adapt those surveys for the element population. So I was sitting in these meetings and I said, well, these studies or these surveys assume that most people have their own bedroom. And the study was going to be about adolescents. And in the United States, many people do have their own bedroom, not all, but often the studies assume both that that young people have their own bedrooms and that it's better to have your own bedroom because then it's going to be quieter and people aren't going to look at their phones, or if someone else is looking at a phone, it won't bother people. So there's all these ideas about what the right kind of sleep is. So in some ways, this was a very minimal or simple kind of intervention on my part to just say, these surveys assume their own bedroom. What if you just asked how many people shared a bedroom on the survey? And they did. And that was great because all kinds of new data was gathered about how many people share bedrooms, how many adolescents, and it turned out a lot. But then something else really interesting happened at a not huge scale, but still meaningful. It turns out that adolescents who shared a bedroom had a lower incidence of mental and emotional sleep disturbances than adolescents who didn't share a bedroom. And that contradicts the sleep hygiene literature in the United States. It's a different kind of finding, and it came from asking a different question that was generated through ethnographic knowledge about how people live their lives. This isn't a cultural belief, it's better to share a bedroom or it's not. It's just often people live in small houses and have to share bedrooms. But people are then used to it and like having the company. So this isn't a finding that says it's better for everyone to share a bedroom. It's a finding to say that in this ecology, at least, sharing bedrooms might be a good thing. It might be protective. It might be useful. So sleep hygiene, public health data that says you should be alone in your bedroom might not be universally true for everyone, depending on where you live or how you grew up. So that was pretty exciting. And I think it was the first time that the folks in Element were like, maybe this ethnography can offer something interesting. Like you could find new stuff, you could ask new questions. And from there we went on and we have developed a larger study now about women and menopause from the Element study. And we've done kind of more in-depth qualitative interviews about menopause and sleep and aging that we hope to expand up to a larger study. And we were able to have one paper that came out of that really kind of, there was a little part that showed this ethnographic finding that was pretty interesting. So that's example one. The next example is a little more complicated. And as you probably imagine, no, Element has been doing FFQs, food frequency questionnaires, for 30 years. I mean, and I think you all know what an FFQ is, probably, right? Okay, so, I had gone with people while they did their FFQs. And I also spent hundreds of hours hanging out with people while they made food and they ate food and they shared food and they talked about food and they went shopping. And it was all just very open. And I had written lots of notes about this. And I knew that a lot of things that are assumed in the public health literature on nutrition don't really make that much sense for working class people in Mexico City, or I would say for working class people in a lot of places in the world. Like, for instance, I knew that when people bought food or made food, they were not thinking about themselves as individuals who were making a choice, like a healthy choice or a non-healthy choice. The most important thing about eating is that you share food. It's collective. You do it together. It's about taking care of each other. I don't think you only need to be working class to understand that, right? I mean, like everyone, like food is for love. You share it with people. And often in kind of contradiction to so much of public health kind of studies and also health behavior work, many people in working class neighborhoods really value fat. Like, fat bodies are healthy bodies. They're bodies that have been taken care of. Their moms loved them. So fat is good, especially for people who have histories of food deprivation, even generational histories of food deprivation. So food is for sharing. I also knew that people probably underreported all kinds of foods in the FFQs because they knew that they were being judged in a way for drinking a lot of soda or eating a lot of junk food. And I also knew that so much of how people eat really wasn't up to them. It had a lot to do with changes in the food landscape. The fact that soda is very cheap, that processed food is very cheap. And if you don't have much money, you're going to buy what's cheap, especially if it tastes really good. So Element, on the other hand, knew all kinds of stuff about diet and eating and had these long-term statistics, numbers about eating. And I was learning a lot about it. And there was a way, I will admit, that I was kind of skeptical of what food frequency questionnaires can tell you. So we spent a very long time, boy, did it take a long time, working on a paper to bring my data together with FFQ data. And it was really powerful for me because I learned a lot about FFQ data and how it actually had a really interesting relationship with what I was finding. So it taught me, oh, there's something really interesting about this FFQ data. So we spent a long time working on this paper, and we were able to write this paper, well, two papers. One paper showed that there is a part of obesity that you can't explain through just saying it has something to do with the mother passing it down. And we were able to talk about how that probably has to do with these global processes that you can see at work in how people buy food and eat food. So that came out in PLOS One, and it was about the influence of postpartum BMI change on childhood obesity energy intake. But we had this little ethnographic section that was about the food landscape, and that was exciting. The next thing we did is we got this paper in the journal called Appetite, where we were able to really bring together the ethnographic data and the FFQ data. And we were able to show that these patterns that are identified in FFQs that get labeled in all these ways as prudent or traditional, or I can't remember the other one, actually match up with things we could see in the field notes, but not in the way that sometimes nutrition scientists think. So in some ways, when there's the discussion of the nutrition transition, it's this idea that all of a sudden there's junk food and then people are choosing to buy it. And then they're having a traditional diet and they're resisting the junk food, or they are having, a transitional diet or a starchy diet, and it's because they love the junk food and they're deciding to buy it. And that didn't really match up with the field notes, but we were able to look at how the patterns loaded with the FFQ data, and we were able to see that instead of being about choice, it had to do with two things potentially: how many economic resources people had, and the fact that in Mexico City, people eat comida. And that's kind of a meal that doesn't fit into the standard dietary kind of FFQ things. It's like a different time of day. And if you put comida together with economic status, you could start seeing how these dietary patterns in the FFQ aligned. Because if you have a lot of resources, you had enough money to buy all kinds of food, junk food and vegetables, and you had enough money to make enough food at comida to have leftovers the next day so you could keep eating the vegetables and all the food. If you don't have that much money, your comida probably doesn't, it has more cheap foods like top ramen or noodles, and you don't have enough food to have leftovers the next day. So it looks like you're mostly eating junk food, even if you sometimes eat vegetables and things like that with your comida. But this is about these things coming together, and it really matched the FFQs, but it doesn't match the story of the food transition. It's about kind of what's available depending on how much money you have. And that actually was really, really interesting and felt like a new finding. So I think for the epidemiologists, what it showed was that the nutrition transition might not explain what we think it explains, and that dietary patterns shouldn't be thought of as an individual choice, and that food frequency questionnaires might actually tell you a lot about what people eat, but again, it's not about choice. For me, I felt like as the ethnographer, it was a really powerful way to put together quantitative and qualitative data. And I was really surprised to find that the FFQs aligned with the field notes, albeit in a different way than anyone fully expected. Mm-hmm.
How do you process your notes? How do you make sure you are interpreting like, or is it biased by this definition?
Great question. Okay, so there's two questions there. How do you process your notes? And a question about bias. They're such good questions. So there's a whole bunch of ways you can process notes, and it kind of depends on if you're doing it more by yourself or as part of a team. And I've been involved with both. So when I was living and working in these two neighborhoods, it's kind of a funny thing. Leaving the house sometimes was exhausting and scary, because if I went out for 1 hour and just talked to people on the street, I mean, you've probably been in neighborhoods that are very close knit, right? So it means you have to say hi to every single person that you pass. So in an hour, I could have 60 interactions with people. I mean, literally, and it would mean that I'd have to go home, and that hour would take 4 hours of writing notes. Like, this is what happened, and I have to think about it. Or if I went to one of the family's houses for comida and I was there for 4 hours, that could be just tons of data. I would also record a lot of these interactions, like at the meals. They would record and someone would transcribe them. And those are amazing ways to go back and see exactly how people talk about stuff and see patterns that you didn't notice when you were there. So when you have these notes written, though, what you can do, you can process them as kind of a person, and like as one person. And I do it a very old-fashioned way, where I have them in a Word document and I'm just highlighting stuff, noticing patterns, and writing myself memos like, oh, this keeps coming up. What does it mean? And then going back over and over again. But when you work in a group, you can use qualitative coding software. So maybe some of you have heard of them. There's something called Deduce that's very user-friendly. There's another one called Atlas TI that our teams have used. It's not quite as user-friendly, but it's very powerful. You could get a ton of data in there. And then people can code the notes as a team. And what you usually do is you read a bunch of the notes and you come up with a first pass idea of like, what are the relevant codes? And then you start coding, but then you keep meeting and saying like, something else is coming up and we need to add it as a code. Something else is coming up, or it turns out that code we developed, it actually doesn't really matter anymore. And get rid of it. It was because we didn't understand at the beginning. Sometimes codes merge, but then at the end, you can start running reports to see how often does that code come up, or are there associations between some code and another code, and you never noticed that they always come together. Like every time someone talks about a 15 años, they talk about going into debt or something like that. And you just didn't really notice it before, but now you do. Or every time someone talks about food in this way, they start talking about how their mother was malnourished when they were young. Or you can start seeing these patterns. But again, the point is you don't know in advance. You might have a clue, but you don't know. This other question about bias is so great because when people ask me that from quantitative fields, I mean, I do two things. I'm going to do them now. One is what an ethnographer is an instrument. I'm an instrument and I'm calibrated in certain ways. You could say, I come from the United States. I'm a woman. I grew up in a middle-class environment. I have certain ideas about what's normal. So when I move through the world, I take things in a particular way. I also did a very long PhD being trained in anthropology to kind of notice that when I find something weird or strange, that's probably a clue that something really interesting is going on, that I need to think more about. Why am I having that reaction? So it's this always like sending it back to yourself. Like if I find something upsetting or alarming, why do I think it's that way? So I'm always kind of trying to understand my own reactions in relation to this question of who I am. The other thing, and so then people say, oh, but that's you, then you're biased. But what I think ethnography does is shows that often when we do large scale studies, like if you go in and you ask a survey, if you don't know about that world, that survey is already biased. You are probably not asking the right questions. You are asking questions based on a sense of the world of the researchers, like that everyone has their own bedroom, or that sleeping by yourself is the good thing to do. And so you're going to ask questions about that, and it's going to generate data that is biased without knowing it's biased. So the point then is to try to kind of not assume we can get rid of it and notice it as best we can. And we do it in this very iterative way. So a lot of, I would say the papers that I've written on my own that I like the most are ones where or books where I kind of was shocked about something. Like, what are you telling me? And then that helps me learn a lot about what's important for this group that's different than my own, and where my own kind of ways of organizing the world come from. So this is kind of an aside. Right now, I'm writing a book about addiction that came from my work in these neighborhoods in Mexico City, where I learned slowly over time that my interlocutors is the word, the people I was hanging out with actually have a really different way of experiencing addiction as positive and not negative. Lots to say about that, but it taught me a lot about my own fears and anxieties and judgment about being dependent on things. So it's often these places that you're like, how could you do that? That is the most interesting thing that you're going to find out about. Okay, so thank you. And more questions are great. Okay, so yeah, question.
It's related to the previous question, and it's something that I always wanted to ask you. So how do you approach people? How do you start the conversation with them? Because we quantitative people, we have our questionnaire, we arrive, we have, I don't know, certain procedures, and they say yes or no, but how do you do that process and start
talking to people? So ethnographers approach people in all kinds of ways. One thing that has been really interesting is that in the last 10 years, my way of approaching people has been completely shaped by collaborating with Mara and Element. So in some ways, Element has been the best entree into people's lives, that an anthropologist has ever had. Like I came as part of this study that people already were involved in and trusted. But the families I got to know had been working with Element for a long time. They stayed with Element. They obviously didn't hate it. They didn't drop out. So it meant that I was able to talk to people. But the really interesting thing was, even though I was coming through Element, people would tell me things about participating in Element all the time. Like, why do they care about lead glazed ceramic dishes? Like, I mean, there's a lot of things that you learn because it's not a secret from Element. It's just, these aren't the things that you tell the people that collect the data. But anthropologists in general, the way you go and you meet people is often like, you go move to wherever people are and you start hanging out and you tell people, I'm an anthropologist, I'm here to take notes. And for the most part, not always, people really like sharing about their lives. They do. I mean, they like it when people are interested in them. I mean, so there's always people that'll be like, I don't want to talk to you, or what are you doing here? But in these two neighborhoods, I was with Element, but in some ways, for most of the neighbors, that didn't matter. They didn't know what Element was. The most important thing in Barrio Norte was I lived with a woman named Señora Nati, and everyone knew and trusted her, and that meant I was okay. And then I'd walk around and I was friendly and didn't act like the police act or public census workers act, who are scared of that neighborhood. And then it just means people talk to you over time and you develop relations with them. And I would do things like go to Zumba class and spend a lot of time at Zumba and getting to know all the women in Zumba classes. And that's where you really hear people talking about their bodies or eating or see how people move. All of those things are your field notes. The other thing is that if you're an anthropologist, everything is data, including talking to Mara, but riding in a taxi is data, because they'll often say, what are you doing here? And oh, I'm an anthropologist, I'm studying this, and they'll tell you everything that they want to tell you about it. When I used to work in Ecuador, I would tell people I study reproductive technologies, and I would tell that to men, taxi drivers, and then they would just start telling me every form of birth control they had ever used. I mean, like, look, I had so many field notes of just these men telling me about every form of birth control that they had ever used. So you start getting a sense of like, how do people talk about sex and babies? But another thing to know that I think is really important, and Mara and I have been really thinking this through, I think in the last few years, as we think about going on into the future, is that when I did this work in these neighborhoods, I had an assistant, and she was from Iztapalapa, so originally. And then later I had another assistant who was also from Iztapalapa. And it was really important that if I had an assistant who was from Mexico City, they could not be fresa. They could not be, they had to be from a similar neighborhood. They had to not feel judged by someone from the outside. The fact that I'm fresa, I mean, in a way, I'm not from Mexico City, but it kind of didn't matter because I'm just an outsider. Like, I think I didn't get what we would call interpolated into the class structure. I'm just this weird outsider. But my assistant was working class, and working in a team is amazing because there was all kinds of things she saw that I could not see. Like I remember she taught me about the importance of the chancla, like throwing, getting hit by your grandmother's chancla or your mother's, like I didn't know what anyone was talking about. And she would explain that to me, but I could see all kinds of things that she couldn't see because she was from there. And you often can't see things when so working in a team and talking constantly is like an amazing thing.
A quick comment.
Yeah.
All the work that we will talk about today has been done also with a third colleague, that is Brisa Sanchez.
Is that
Brisa?
on? Is that on? Is that?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
it is on.
Okay.
Brisa is a biostatistician from Drexel University. And one day she said, well, she always say brilliant things.
Yeah.
But, perdón, algún día ella dijo cosas, siempre dice cosas brillantes, es una mujer muy brillante. Pero un día dijo, es que la etnografía es Big Data. Y de veras es Big Data, es impresionante. Y ahorita que hacías tu pregunta, es que el sistema de información que tenemos detrás de esto es impresionante. O sea, es Big Data. Ya, that's it.
Mhm.
How did you get or did you obtain?
Puedes hablar en español, porfa.
¿Cómo obtuvieron la aprobación del comité de ética cuando tienen una metodología abierta?
Sí,
O sea,
es una
pues-
pregunta muy buena y tal vez Mara puede hablar un poco más sobre.
Que creímos
Ujú.
que iba a ser muy difícil. Creímos que el no tener hipótesis, pero no. O sea, lo que hicimos fue explicar lo que es la etnografía, hicimos una sustentación adecuada y ni siquiera te podría decir que tuvimos muchos problemas. O sea, de verdad, la evaluaron, a lo mejor hubo una ronda de comentarios y sí le echamos mucho coco y mucho trabajo para presentarlo bien, porque sentíamos que era difícil, ¿no? Sobre todo en el primero, en Mexpost, la del 6 familias. Ya en SMEX ya no era, ya había una dirección más, pero sí de verdad, no te diría que ha sido de las peores historias que tuvimos en la comisión.
O sea, nos exigen tanto con el consentimiento informado que pues esto no tiene un consentimiento.
No, no,
Claro,
sí,
Sí tiene.
sí hay.
Claro, claro.
Sí hay.
Ok,
No,
ok,
consentimiento
porque-
para todo y consentimiento para grabar y consentimiento para tomar fotos, pero por supuesto,
Ujú.
claro, claro.
Pero
por
el
supuesto.
consentimiento es diferente que los usuales. Es muy amplio. Ya. Ujú. Ujú.
Gracias. Sí.
Ah, sí.
No, nada más un comentario. Yo creo que es muy diferente que hubieran sometido este proyecto de manera aislada. Y no hay que olvidar que este venía como parte de un proyecto ya encaminado y que yo creo que eso simplificó mucho, porque sí, efectivamente, desde la perspectiva de comité de ética, si llega a una cosa totalmente aislada, hubiera sido muy complicado
Ujú.
entenderlo y después aprobarlo, ¿no?
Ujú. Y también, so when I did my dissertation fieldwork, which was in Ecuador in vitro fertilization clinics, I wasn't working with a project like Element. I was just me. And I was a graduate student at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and I just did an IRB with Berkeley, but I wasn't, and I talked a lot with the clinics I worked in, but I didn't have to go through this large thing. The thing about ethnographic work is that it's very open-ended, but you're not usually gathering you're not gathering biological data. You change everybody's name. So there's all these processes to do it. But I think the fact that it wasn't isolated, like Belém was saying, and part of Element, it was a little bit kind of like an addendum. I mean, I don't know if you'd want to think about it this way. It was a different kind of thing, but it went okay. It wasn't terrible.
We work hard.
Yes.
I mean, we submitted something strong.
Mhm.
It was not just hanging out. No era nada más decir, ay, pues se va a
No,
venir.
yeah.
No. Ya habíamos avanzado un poquito. Sí.
Yeah. So, I just took you through the sleep and the eating. And in some ways, it was like so many things, like a snowball, right? There was ways in which Mara and some of the Element researchers were, I think, starting to see like, we can learn something from this crazy lady that just has a lot of data. And so, eventually we put together this project called NESMEX, and we were able to get relatively large funding for an anthropologist to do this project from the NSF. And it brought in epidemiologists and engineers. So I'm going to tell you about that project now. And it had an ethnographic backstory. It really came out of spending thousands of hours with people, watching how they lived and what they did every day, including how they didn't really drink very much water. So when I came to Mexico City, started coming in 2013-14, at that point, and there still is, there was billboards all over the city, like this one. Raise the amount of water you drink and lower your soda consumption. And these were all over the place, right? But I was in these households noticing that pretty much no one drank water or very little water. And that when I asked for water, because I'm like a good middle-class person and I don't like soda, often people didn't have any water to give me. So I was really interested in that. And it felt like there was all kinds of disconnects like going on. One of them was public health, you people telling people don't drink soda and people drinking soda. And another disconnect was I was learning from these urban water ecologists at UNAM at an institute called LANCES. It's a very cool institution. They were helping me understand that when water arrives in people's homes at the llave, the water quality actually meets water quality safety standards. So I had this idea that, oh, maybe people aren't drinking the water because the water is bad, but I was learning the water is good. So, and people were telling me they didn't really want to drink the tap water, and they were telling me a lot about how good soda is. And that's actually what a lot of the addiction book is about. It's about soda and being addicted to soda. So I found out people didn't drink soda and that people experience water as unreliable in all these ways. And they experience soda as really reliable, really cheap, and really delicious, and a really good thing to share with other people. But I was really confused, like, okay, but people don't drink it. And what is the real reason? Is it because soda is so much better, or is it because people don't trust state services, or is it because the soda is so subsidized? Like, what's going on? And working with Mara and then these people at LANCES, we were able to put together a pretty huge and unusual project that brought together ethnographers, epidemiologists, and engineers to try to understand what are all the things that are making it so people don't drink water, so they don't turn on the tap and drink the water. And you can, again, just to say a little bit more, this is the kind of thing that an anthropologist would say that you can't just administer a survey about. Down the road, you could maybe ask a survey, but first you have to know the right questions. So what the project was like, what are the right questions? What is going on in people's houses? So like I said, we brought all these people together and we designed a project that was a little bit ethnographic, a little bit epidemiological, and a little bit environmental engineering, and not really a lot of any of those things. Like it was, I mean, it wasn't ethnographic because it wasn't long time hanging out. And it wasn't really, we only gathered a few biosamples, and the engineers always had a hypothesis. So they were kind of freaked out that we didn't have a hypothesis. So what we did is we went into 60 element households 3 times each. And we gathered all kinds of data that I'll tell you about in a minute. And then there was a pandemic. So then we didn't get to finish. So we then designed a virtual visit where we kind of did the remaining stuff at the end, because we only gathered about half the data that we wanted to gather before the pandemic. And what I would say is the data we gathered put us in a great place to generate very robust hypotheses. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And Jose Luis is gone, so he can't talk about it. Okay. So the data we gathered, and I'm just going to go over quickly here. The biomarker data we gathered was hair, cortisol, stress, saliva, to get at epigenetic stuff, glucose, and blood lead levels, because we had to ask about blood lead, even though, because Mara was on the study. And then we gathered data from these household water sensors. How do you do this? Oh no. Okay. Oh no. Okay. So up there, right there, we developed these sensors that would measure the water quality in real time as it came into the house. And we did grab sampling of water. You would gather the water and do water quality testing for bacteria, chlorine levels, metals, pH. Okay. Oh, it's perfect. You did it. You did it. You did it. Okay. Oh, should we answer questions? Okay. Should I answer those?
Yes. Carlos Íntores pregunta si hay lugar presencial. Claro que sí, Carlos, vente. Adelante. David, how similar are the characteristics of most of the population from the element cohort, education, income, and geographical location in comparison to both areas where she lived?
Well, I think what we found, I mean, there were only really 6 families, but it very much matches the larger cohort, the 6 families. And I picked the 2 neighborhoods because even though they had a high density of element participants, they were different from each other. One of them was a very tight-knit, closed community that had this reputation for being very dangerous and was somewhat poorer. And the other one was a little bit wealthier. I mean, it wasn't wealthy, and it was gentrifying and had it was much bigger. But what I found out was that that neighborhood that was considered a nicer neighborhood was actually a more dangerous neighborhood than the neighborhood that was considered dangerous, because the neighborhood that was considered dangerous had such tight-knit boundaries. They actually kept out the police. But Mara and I have done some work on looking at how representative the neighborhoods are, and they fit kind of within the range of most of the neighborhoods. But here's another thing that happened. Element had actually never really looked at the neighborhoods before that people lived in until I came along, I think, and said, let's think about neighborhoods. And we spent a lot of time, Mara and I, figuring out what are all the neighborhoods that Element families lived in. And that was a whole new data set that we now can think about when we do studies going forward. So we now know that those 2 neighborhoods are fairly representative, even though they're not the same.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, because we, of course, have geocoding, but that doesn't mean neighborhoods. Neighborhood is more related with daily lives people, right? Someone is asking, perdón, alguien pregunta que si se va a guardar el seminario. Creo que sí, creo que se está grabando. Creo que se está grabando y que sí se puede poner en el repositorio del instituto. Ojalá que así sea, porque las fotos las escogimos y cada foto tiene un mensaje que no se están viendo. Pero yo creo que cuando si lo vieron, tienen ganas de volver a ver, hay mensajes. Lisa, I just want to say something else. ¿Saben qué fue súper interesante para los ingenieros? Así como decía Lisa, pues no fue ni etnografía ni epidemiología, pero fue un poquito de todo. Para los ingenieros era increíble que estaban dentro de una casa, porque los ingenieros ambientales, que además son unos fragonazos y fragonazas en lo que hacen en Ann Arbor, siempre era en los ríos, en los lagos, en el drenaje, pero no dentro de una casa. Y, por ejemplo, transmitirles el valor del IRB a ellos, esa comunicación fue muy difícil. Y no sé si lo logramos a la fecha. Pero bueno, sí está ya, ¿verdad? Ok.
Sí. So we gathered all these different kinds of data sets. So the water data was very cool. And besides the water data, the engineer who was with us on the team, he mapped household water infrastructure. And this was, for me, another moment of how cool, how great it is to collaborate, because we were in houses that I had been in for 4 years, because the 6 families ended up in this study. But I don't know anything about water infrastructure. And he showed me all these things that were going on in these houses that I had never noticed, because of course I'm biased. I don't go around understanding water infrastructure, but he has a kind of expertise, so he could see this in amazing ways that I'm about to tell you about. They also developed these household water sensors for the first time for a domestic use. And, you know, if we have time, we can talk more about them. They were very cool. Okay, why are you not going forward? Okay, it's not going forward. Okay. So we had a lot of findings. We had so much data, and we actually had no idea kind of how to organize it, and we're still figuring it out. But the ethnographic data was huge, the amount of ethnographic data, but the engineering data and the ethnographic data came together and showed us something very powerful. We have all kinds of findings, but we're going to focus on a big one that we found. which was the importance of water intermittency in understanding how people connect to or relate to water. And this was something I kind of knew because I had been spending time in houses, but I didn't know it fully because I was only spending time in a small number of houses and because I'm not an engineer. So intermittency, probably all of you know what it is. In the United States, people don't understand what it is necessarily, but it simply means not having water 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Most of the people that actually, that's not true. A lot of the people in our sample had a continuous water supply, and a little bit less than half had an intermittent water supply. But we found that the fear of intermittency is also a huge thing that shapes water in Mexico, because all of this relates to the fact that almost everyone, it turns out in Mexico City, probably here too, stores water. How many of you have a tinaco in your apartment or house? I mean, does anyone not have a tinaco? Like, everyone has a cistern or a tinaco, right? And storing water means all kinds of things. It makes people organize their lives in particular ways. And in these working class households, storing water meant that women had to spend a lot of their day managing water because they didn't always have enough water, enough resources to have an electrical system to move the water around their house. They would manually move the water, like they'd have to turn on the pump, or they'd have to wake up at 3 in the morning when they heard the water come and go turn something on to fill the tinacos and the cisterns. And this management meant that they have intimacy with their water. And intimacy with your water means that you know that storing water deteriorates the water quality. So no matter how good the water is that comes into the house, if you have to store your water, the water quality deteriorates by the time it gets to the kitchen sink. And in a certain way, you probably all know this, but it hadn't been systematically studied in a way, right? So we learn that residents would often tell us the water that comes from the city, it's great water. We actually trust it. It wasn't about them not trusting government services, but it's about the fact that the intermittency made they had to store water. Oh, so next slide. And so, yes, here's tinacos. It's nice talking to a group of people that knows what a tinaco is, because when I talk about this in the US, no one knows what a tinaco is. So there we go. So this kind of goes over the same thing. It was about the threat of intermittency, and intermittency itself means that people store water, and that has all these cascading consequences. So we were able to put together these ethnographic data with the engineering data, and that's been really cool and really fun. So these are images that this engineer drew to kind of schematically show how water moves through households. It's probably similar to some of your households. Water comes in from the public supply, and then it goes into a cistern or a tinaco, and then it gets to the kitchen sink. And we were then able to do all of these studies of the water quality when it arrived in the house, when it sits in a cistern, when it's in a tinaco, and when it gets to the kitchen sink. And we were able to show that often water is great, meets water quality standards, but by the time it gets to the kitchen sink, it has completely deteriorated. And there isn't very much published on this out there. But this is not, again, a cultural reason for why people don't like water. It's like an ecological reason. You know, there's a good reason not to really drink the water that comes out of your kitchen sink. I'm going to skip that one. And so then this is an image again of how people know this. They live with this. So there's a quote up there that says, I think the water tanks deteriorate the quality of the water. Like, it just doesn't make sense to drink the water. So messages telling people to drink water and not soda don't completely make sense, because it's not really acknowledging that the water at the kitchen tap doesn't really make sense to drink. It's also not acknowledging that going and buying garrafones can be very expensive. it's actually often not that much less than soda. And another thing that I found ethnographically, not through this, but through my general work, was people talk about, well, we have to leave the house to go buy something to drink because we can't drink the water from the tap. So I don't have a car. We don't have a car. So if I'm going to walk down the street, I am not going to buy a garrafón and carry it home. I'm going to buy 3 things of soda. It doesn't cost that much more. It's the same cost, meaning the garrafón costs 20 pesos and the liter of soda, yeah, okay. A garrafón costs 30 and the soda gets cheaper and cheaper and you can bring it home and you don't hurt your back or your neck. So there's all kinds of reasons that it makes sense to drink soda and not water. We also did a small study of water from purificadoras, not garrafón de marca, but like, and the water quality in the purificadora was often worse than the kitchen sink tap. And that's the cheaper water. Yes. So this led to all kinds of new questions that came from this combination of ethnography, engineering, and the epidemiological data, which we actually haven't really fully analyzed yet about stress and water insecurity. But we were able to, I think I'm going to point out 3 big things that this is a huge list of questions. But one thing is water intermittency is increasing worldwide. Over 1 billion people do not have a continuous water supply on this earth. Most people live with an intermittent water supply, and more people are going to live with this. And in the public health literature, mostly an intermittent supply is connected to issues around infectious disease, bacteria. But I think what we are showing is we need to think about it in terms of chronic disease. Having an intermittent water supply is probably predictive of drinking, not drinking water. And we need to think about that as more and more people are going to have to deal with an intermittent water supply. Another thing that we found is that an intermittent supply, especially for working class people, really entails a lot of financial outlay for people that don't have a lot of money, buying tinacos and cisterns, but also a lot of labor on the part of mostly women. We found that mostly men built the systems, but women manage them. And that means all kinds of things. It means you might not be able to leave the house to go to work, because if you have to get up at 3 a.m. to turn the water on, maybe you're too asleep, or you have to wait at home because the water's going to come. It also means women spend hours of their day managing water. And this is very important because it's going to relate to something Mara tells you about in a minute. We also found that women were often really proud of how well they manage water for their families in relation to scarcity. So we also did this other survey with a political scientist, and she used our ethnographic data, and it helped us understand that in many ways, this isn't something people are furious about. Like the story of intermittency isn't only negative. People can adapt to it. Probably more of us can adapt to intermittency in all kinds of ways that are fine, but we need to understand it impacts water quality. So if more of us are going to live with intermittency and learn to adapt to it, maybe we can make it more equitable, like Condesa can have an intermittent supply and people can manage. They have money to buy pumps. We could also think about the grid expanding beyond the llave at the street. Like, what if we did other things to help people? But we had all these questions. But we, as NESMEX, didn't really have the capacity to answer those questions because we were only in 60 households in Mexico City. So then, thank God, we had Mara on the team. So she came up with this amazing idea, and we're going to be showing you some data from it that no one's ever seen before.
Yeah. Pues fascinados en toda esta historia. Un día, además, no teníamos muchos recursos, se nos acaban los recursos. Y Lisa me escribe con una propuesta de financiamiento. Oye, ¿qué tal? A todo el equipo. ¿Qué tal si aplicamos esta propuesta? Y la verdad es que en ese momento, no sé por qué, se me ocurrió cuál es la mejor manera de probar que esto es útil, que esto verdaderamente genera información útil para una posible intervención en salud pública. A mí esa parte me interesa mucho a nivel personal. Me acuerdo que te escribí de manera personal y no a todos y le dije, oye, ¿no es una locura proponer hacerlo en la ENSANUT? Dijimos, pues tenemos un trabajo sólido, sentimos que metodológicamente lo que estamos haciendo es valioso, estamos trabajando en un artículo que esperamos sea importante. Entonces lo propusimos al comité del ENSANUT, les contamos cuál era la idea y sometimos un financiamiento a un centro en la Universidad de Michigan para ver si nos financiaban en análisis. Y bueno, lo logramos y en la ENSANUT 2022, en la que del año pasado, logramos, no les voy a ustedes a contar qué es la ENSANUT, esta diapositiva era un poco pensada en la audiencia de Londres, pero pues parte del trabajo fue cómo cerramos esta investigación en preguntas. Sí, no, 1, 2, 3. Pero tenían que cerrarse, porque pues la ENSANUT no era completamente cuantitativa. Y entonces lo que nosotros propusimos fueron 13 preguntas, 15 preguntas completamente cerradas y la propuesta de financiamiento tenía 3 objetivos. Si me falta uno, me ayudas a recordar. Uno es bueno, primero entender cuál es la magnitud de la intermitencia en el abasto de agua en los hogares en el país, cómo se asocia con enfermedades crónicas y si hay algún rol en las dinámicas de género al interior del hogar asociadas a la intermitencia. O sea, queríamos probar esto de que el rol de las mujeres en los hogares en el tema de la intermitencia, cómo se asociaba también con la parte económica. Entonces, era como muy amplio la propuesta. Entonces, pues lo que nosotros sentimos es que por primera vez estábamos teniendo una pregunta de investigación. O sea, nos tardamos 10 años, pero teníamos una pregunta de investigación numérica y demás, y la podíamos presentar en la ENSANUT esperando que tenga una relevancia política en términos de salud pública. Bueno, aquí están los objetivos, ¿no? Claro, gracias. Bueno, lo primero que queríamos era pues poner en la agenda el tema, porque todo mundo, si ustedes se fijan en el censo, se pregunta si estás conectado a la red del agua. Nada más. Eso es y claro, el 99% de este país tiene conexión al agua, ¿no? Tiene agua. La definición de tener agua es si estás conectado. Pero este tema no estaba. Ahorita les voy a platicar otro enfoque que está en la ENSANUT, que es el de inseguridad del agua, pero bueno, era como poner en la agenda el tema de la intermitencia. Y por otro lado, consideramos, como lo comentaba Lisa hace rato, que es un tema que puede ser no solo relevante para México, sino para otros países en un contexto de cambio climático, en un contexto de países en condiciones con escasez de agua. Entonces, sí creemos que puede ser útil no solo para México. Bueno, entonces, a mí me emocionó ver a Lisa diseñando preguntas cerradas, ¿no? Bien cerradas. Y bueno, las preguntas iban en ese sentido, ¿no? Sobre qué tan frecuente tienen agua, cuáles son diferentes formas de abordar la intermitencia, en fin, ese era el tema, ¿no? Tampoco quisiéramos como detenernos mucho en eso. Pero lo que les queremos presentar es un diagrama de Pau. Y lo que encontramos fue verdaderamente estrujante, porque lo que encontramos es que, como les decía, de acuerdo al censo, el 99% de la población de este país tiene agua. Sin embargo, lo que nosotros vemos en la parte grande del país es que prácticamente el 70% de la población en el país sufre de algún tipo de intermitencia de agua. ¿Cuál es el estándar internacional? 24/7, ¿no? 24 horas, 7 días de la semana. Entonces, en este país, prácticamente el 70% no cumple ese estándar. 30% declaran no haber tenido intermitencia de agua en el último año. Y en el último mes, solo 17%. Esto es súper interesante y aquí voy a hacer una pequeña paréntesis que no. En el ENSANUD y con un impulso internacional grande, se pregunta sobre inseguridad del agua, una versión más o menos equivalente a lo de inseguridad alimentaria, pero para agua. Si ustedes ven las preguntas sobre inseguridad del agua, mucho se pregunta si usted ha sentido enojo por no tener agua, se refiere mucho a sentimientos en relación al agua. Lo cual es súper interesante, porque si ustedes contrastan los resultados de inseguridad del agua, si mal no recuerdo, es al orden de 20%. 19% declaran tener inseguridad, caen en la categoría de seguridad, mientras que nosotros es exactamente lo opuesto. Además, la barra roja grande, 33%, son de los que tuvieron agua todo el diario durante el último año, pero aún los que tuvieron agua con intermitencia, no quiere decir que recibieron diario. Entonces, es súper interesante. Encontramos en la ENSANUD que 8% de los hogares recibió agua menos de 3 días en un mes. En un mes. Y creo que ese es un dato brutal que se pudo obtener por la pregunta de investigación. Cuando vemos la distribución de la intermitencia por región, qué pena que no se vea bien, lo que podemos ver es que en principio donde hay más agua es en el sur, ¿cierto? Sin embargo, donde hay más intermitencia es en la zona sur y hay menos intermitencia en la zona norte, lo cual para mí fue súper antiintuitivo. Acabábamos de ver todo lo que había pasado en las sequías en el norte, pues a pesar de eso hay un mejor manejo de agua. Estas diapositivas no se han presentado todavía, tienen la exclusiva. Y bueno, lo que también pudimos ver es que estaba completamente asociado a nivel socioeconómico y por supuesto las poblaciones con mayor nivel socioeconómico tienen menos intermitencia y las de menor nivel socioeconómico tienen más intermitencia. Es una pena que José Luis se tuvo que ir porque tuvo una emergencia de trabajo, pero lo que queríamos es que él iba a presentar estas diapositivas porque además es padrísimo que pues ya es con todo el análisis de la perspectiva económica que trajeron José Luis y Sergio al equipo, ¿no? Pero bueno, entonces, ¿qué es lo que estamos viendo? Fíjense, con Element habíamos tenido ¿por qué no nos fijamos en el tamaño de muestra? El tamaño de muestra ha reflejado mucho el enfoque. Entonces, cuando nosotros tuvimos las cortes, teníamos 700 parejas, madres e hijos. Déjenme citar a Brisa, la bioestadística con la que hemos trabajado esta historia, porque la primera vez que Lisa presentó la posibilidad de MexPost, y lo digo porque somos súper colegas, cuando se fue Lisa, Brisa dijo, aguas, no podemos inferir nada de 6 hogares. O sea, era el mismo escepticismo que yo sentí en el primera entrevista, lo sintió Brisa. Entonces, Lisa sola se fue con MexPost, ¿no? Con la plataforma de Element, pero se fue sola con MexPost en seis hogares, en 2 colonias, y con eso, con el financiamiento de National Science Foundation, pudimos hacer NESMEX, que ya fueron 60. O sea, allá, por eso digo que es un semillero de ideas, de hipótesis. En alguna ocasión me invitaron a hablar más del lado de Lisa y entonces estaba yo un poco más activa y les decía que para mí la etnografía es como cuando pierdes las llaves del coche en la noche y prendes la lámpara, pero solo buscas alrededor de la lámpara y no encuentras las llaves del coche. La etnografía prende la luz de la habitación y la encuentras en otros lados. O sea, sí siento que con lo que aprendimos en esas 6 familias, nos permitió ir un poco, agrandar un poco más la perspectiva de investigación hacia NSMEX, y sí fue interesantísimo poner sensores de agua, hacer todo lo que hicimos en los hogares, pero esa solidez pues nos permitió llegar al ENSANUT, en el ENSANUT 2022, y ya también vamos a estar en la 2023. Entonces, pues han sido muchos retos. Yo creo que nos hemos colgado demasiado en la presentación. Yo no sé si queremos ir a cada uno de estos. No sé si quieras que vayamos. Yo de estos puntos, aparte del evidente financiamiento y la velocidad, yo sí creo que algo que para mí ha sido un aprendizaje enorme es la importancia de tener un poco de humildad epistemológica. O sea, como que siempre estamos bien abrazados y bien casados con nuestros métodos, y nuestros métodos son los chidos, porque pues, son los míos, ¿no? Y la verdad es que abrirse y escuchar otros métodos, aprender otros métodos y más, vivimos en un mundo complejo. Entonces, para mí esta frase de la humildad epistemológica es algo que me retumba mucho en la cabeza, ¿no? Yo creo que no, de verdad no quisiera ir a todos estos puntos, pero sí quisiera que terminar, termino, pues cómo hemos cambiado, ¿no? Evidentemente que hemos cambiado muchísimo las dos y el equipo con el que trabajamos. Sería maravilloso tener aquí a Brisa, pero pues está muy difícil. Pero algo que a mí sí me mete mucho ruido es, ¿a qué se le llama validación? O sea, yo quiero pensar como epidemióloga, ¿qué pasa cuando hablamos de un cuestionario validado y estandarizado? Voy a comentar que esta reflexión la tuve hace poco en una reunión sobre inseguridad del agua, y alguien hablaba, pero ¿cómo es posible que en México, en el ENSANUT, pusieron una foto cuando en Nigeria la pregunta se hizo así, y en Etiopía? Y yo no me atreví a hablar. No me atreví a hablar porque yo sí creo que a mí esto me lleva a una reflexión de qué significa validez y estandarización. ¿Hasta qué punto, si queremos medir intermitencia a nivel mundial? Sí, yo creo que sí se puede, pero no con las mismas preguntas del ENSANUT. Tendríamos que ir pensando en diseñar quizá preguntas diferentes para ser verdaderamente válidos y verdaderamente tener un concepto validado. No sé, es una pregunta que dejo en la mesa y que nosotras estamos trabajando mucho en esto. ¿Hasta qué punto podemos diseñar programas de intervención que sean realmente efectivos si no estamos entendiendo cómo se relaciona la población con el entorno? Quien vaya a ir al simposio de Exposoma, Lisa, Anita Hardon y yo vamos a tener un panel sobre este tema en el contexto de la investigación ambiental. Rápidamente estamos haciendo esta etnografía, pero desde la perspectiva ambiental. Estuvimos en 2 casas de la Corte Progres haciendo una evaluación de todos los químicos a los que nos exponemos cada día, ¿no? A los participantes les dijimos, ¿qué shampoo te pones? ¿Qué desodorante te pones? Imagínense la cantidad de químicos que estamos rodeados y que no están contemplados cuando venimos con la investigación le decimos, ¿y tú consumes flúor? ¿Y tú te expusiste a PFAS? O sea, hay un montón de cosas ahí como para pensar y reflexionar, y pues te toca a ti cerrar en cómo has cambiado.
Okay, sí. Qué lástima, pero tal vez, José Luis, puedas hablar un poco sobre esta experiencia para trabajar con las locas juntas. it's been so exciting and challenging and gratifying to do this kind of work over the last 10 years. And as Mara said, you know, she's changed, and it's an amazing thing to see someone change and then to feel yourself change. So I think one of the there's all kinds of things I do now that are very different than I did 10 years ago. Most anthropologists don't really co-author papers, for instance, and I've had to learn about that and not done a great job many times. But I think the bigger thing is to talk about how I am now part of making numbers, and anthropologists are very skeptical of numbers. I mean, partly because we think that often those numbers aren't made with by being tethered to a reality. But it's easy to stand outside and say, I don't approve of those numbers you made, and then to be part of a process of making them. And that involves compromise and engaging in forms of reductionism, because what we're good at as anthropologists is having this morass of big data where we say, oh, it's really complicated and I don't want to break it down into 3 categories. But it's been very powerful to say, oh, if we step back and we collect enough numbers, maybe we can see that there's these 3 patterns of eating habits, for instance, and they are tethered to a reality, and they might not mean the same thing or they might not mean what the epidemiologists think they mean, but there are these patterns that emerge and we can interpret them in new and powerful ways. But again, this fact of being responsible for those numbers is a strange feeling in all kinds of ways, especially to my colleagues in anthropology who are like, numbers are, you know, we always know numbers are bad, but I'm trying to be part of making numbers that I'll stand behind and say, I think it's pretty powerful to find out a characteristic description of intermittency in Mexico that we never thought to ask about before. So this is kind of like a really different mode of doing research in the world. And I think that does take a lot of epistemic humility, learning that if you're going to play with other fields, you're going to have to really understand what they're doing and appreciate what it brings to the world. And then let's see, outward facing, inward. And it's strange to be talking to other fields in all kinds of ways that feel actually quite powerful. Okay, I can't, let's see. It will not go to the next. Can you just go to the, can you just go to the next slide and then we'll answer the questions? Oh, okay. So all it is what I've learned in the last 10 years is that when people in epidemiology or engineering give talks, they always have slides like this at the end to thank all of the teams that are part of making knowledge and making quantitative knowledge. And anthropologists usually never have slides like this. We do the work by ourselves. We go hang out with the 6 families by ourselves and we write up the data ourselves, and we write a book or a few articles and 3 other anthropologists read it. And we don't have slides like this. And I think a huge way that I've changed is to get to have a slide like this and to be part of these teams that feel like we're now using ethnography to make a much more powerful impact in the world, but to also get to spend time with 2 beautiful people like this and to get to have this collective collaborative experience of making knowledge together in whole new ways is a change and something I'm immensely grateful for. So thank you. And hopefully there'll be lots of questions.
Si hay preguntas en el chat, gracias. Socorro tiene una pregunta. Nada más, a mí me gustaría invitar a José Luis a que también nos diga cómo ha cambiado, porque él debería de haber presentado los datos del ENSANUT. Y ya, pasamos a las preguntas, pero es parte del equipo.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Pues 30 segundos. Bueno, ¿cómo ha cambiado? Bueno, yo soy actuario de formación y luego estudié economía, entonces, bueno, tengo un background cuantitativo. Y desde hace un año estoy trabajando en este proyecto de agua que ahorita Mara y Liz les contaron un poquito y para mí es una manera muy poderosa de pensar las cosas de manera diferente, porque, bueno, desde comunicarnos, ¿no? Con Liz, por ejemplo, de el tipo de preguntas, comunicar los resultados, lo que encuentras de manera cuantitativa, etcétera, pero sobre todo creo que la manera de generar conocimiento, para mí es muy poderoso este approach, esta combinación entre cuantitativo y cualitativo, porque pues sí, te ayuda a pensar, a repensar las cosas desde otro punto de vista que al menos en mi caso nunca hubiera pasado si no hubiéramos trabajado juntos, ¿no? Y se generan hipótesis de manera mucho más holística, se genera también información o la interpretación de la información de los resultados también resulta diferente. Entonces, bueno, lo único que puedo decir es que ha sido muy enriquecedor para mí con mi bar. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. De hecho, José Luis es el investigador responsable del proyecto con la Universidad de Michigan que financió este análisis del Ensanud. Gracias, José
Gracias,
Luis.
muchas gracias. Y perdón por no llegar a las 3 diapositivas.
No te preocupes, gracias. Vamos a darle el paso a unas preguntas por chat y luego vamos con Socorro. Espérenme, aquí dice... Fátima Estrada pregunta, ¿cómo se hizo la selección de las familias a observar? Excelente pregunta.
Gracias.
Hay varias, pero vamos una por una.
Okay. Should we?
Sí.
Okay. So the 6 families in the original Mexpo study in the 2 neighborhoods, basically, we knew that there was a density of participants in those neighborhoods. And so there was, there was at least 10 families in these neighborhoods. And it was simply the families that said yes. I mean, we didn't have a huge number. And so I originally had, I'd love it if there was like a boy and a girl and someone else, but we just couldn't do that. It was the 3 families that said yes in the neighborhoods. With the NESMEC study, we spent a lot of time deciding on 15 neighborhoods that we were going to work in. We were going to gather 3 element households from 15 neighborhoods, and we wanted to focus on these neighborhoods. And we spent a lot of time deciding on the neighborhoods and their characteristics, like how often they had water, where they were located in the city, and all of these things. And we spent weeks figuring out those 15 neighborhoods. And then when we went to do the recruitment, it was impossible. There was no way that we could get 3 families in each of those neighborhoods because Element is actually spread out between 347 neighborhoods, and there just wasn't the numbers in those neighborhoods. So if someone said no, we would pick neighborhoods that had like 10 people, but we just couldn't get the numbers. So we ended up doing the 60 households in 47 neighborhoods. And this is also a thing where this is kind of how ethnography and all research goes. We thought we were really going to be able to say a lot about the neighborhoods in the NESMEC study, and we weren't able to because we did 47 neighborhoods instead of 15, and we really didn't have the density of participants. But I think in some ways, that's what happened. And we were able to kind of scale up to the nation instead of focus on the neighborhood. So it was a pretty good trade-off.
Gracias. Astrid Schillman nos invita al seminario de CISP el próximo jueves 25 a las 3 de la tarde, en donde se revisará el tema de agua en Tláhuac. Súper interesante. Ahí estaremos, Astrid. Es jueves, ya se acabó el simposio. Antonio Galindo pregunta, ¿el manejo del agua de las comunidades varía en función de la gestión comunitaria? Los gobiernos federales y estatales no administran los servicios del agua. En entrevistas a las comunidades se observa que en entrevistas a las comunidades se observan que las comunidades con y sin usos y costumbres tienen mucho... Perdónenme, es que...
It was about the governance of water in communities, basically, where the federal... It's here.
Tienen muchos problemas de administración del agua entre los habitantes y lo anterior genera diversos problemas. Perdón, Antonio, por leer tan mal tu pregunta, pero no me acomodo con esta computadora. Do you want to?
See. So one of the things that we asked all the families was about, okay, so in Mexico City, for the most part, the water comes from SACMEX. It's not administered through another body, and there was a few households that didn't receive water. And we did ask people, though, if there were problems with their neighbors about water. And sometimes we found out that there would be issues around water governance kind of in the neighborhood, or there was a little bit of issues within households. But we also found things like households that didn't get water for whatever reason. There was piped water in the neighborhood, but something strange would happen and they wouldn't have water. They often got water from their neighbors, but we weren't able to really look at this level of neighborhood or community governance in the way that this question's getting at. I think that would be a great question to ask outside of Mexico City. And also you could ask potentially in places like, I don't know, Xochimilco, where there's all kinds of ejidos that govern natural resources in a different way, but we weren't able to kind of get at that level. We were just looking in Mexico City where mostly people had piped water, whether or not it was coming to the house.
David hace dos comentarios. Uno dice que las áreas geográficas con menor disponibilidad de agua tengan mejor infraestructura en el sistema de agua es algo común. El gasto en mantenimiento del sistema de tuberías en California es órdenes de veces mayor que en el noreste de los Estados Unidos. Esto se repite en los países árabes petroleros y en Australia. Creo que habla de las inequidades, ¿no? Y luego el segundo comentario dice, coincido en que los investigadores cuantitativos deberíamos de ser más humanos y los cualitativos deben perder el miedo a lo cuantitativo. Por supuesto. Gracias por tus comentarios, David. El último, el penúltimo. Leith León dice, gracias Liz y Mara por su excelente charla. Entiendo que formamos equipos multidisciplinarios. No obstante, no necesariamente hay expertos en ambas metodologías en un equipo, o tal vez un investigador joven se aventura a incluir métodos mixtos en una propuesta. Para trabajar métodos mixtos, una investigadora o investigador tiene necesariamente que ser experto en ambas metodologías, sino expertos en entender ambas perspectivas, cómo entenderle a los métodos mixtos.
You should say something too. It is such a good question. And I think now after 10 years, I don't think that there's a right answer to that. I think that one thing feels very clear to me, that I'm never going to be an epidemiologist and I'm never going to be an engineer. I'm going to be an anthropologist, and I'm trained that way. And I think there is something really powerful about people who are trained very strongly in a field, epidemiology, health economics, or being an economist, and then coming together and figuring out how to bring your methods together. And that is very, very powerful. And there's a lot to say, I think, about, for instance, in many schools of public health in the United States, anthropologists work there, but they often really can't do what they are best at doing because they are in a school of public health that makes them get funding in ways that you have to have a hypothesis in advance, or the anthropologists are asked to be on a study where all of the questions have already been decided. And that's actually not really letting ethnographers do what they do best. Like, in some ways, if you're going to collaborate, I think the best way to deploy these mixed methods is let the methods do what they do. And that would mean having these open-ended stages where you have an ethnographer go in. And in the last few years, we've been working with some young people who have been trained. Actually, they got trained by me working in this ethnographic coding lab, and then they went off to get trained in demographic methods. So I'm thinking of Faith, for instance. So she has worked in quantitative and qualitative fields. And when I look at someone like her, she feels like the future. I mean, she's amazing. She can do both things very well. And I don't think I could actually, I have almost failed every math class I have ever taken. Maybe that's the reason I'm scared of numbers, not just because I don't trust them. So I'm not going to be the person that's ever going to do a statistical analysis. I think I'm a pretty good field worker. I'm good at taking field notes. I'm not going to make the numbers or even analyze them. But there are people like Faith or some of these other younger people that we're training that I think really can do both, but I don't think it's necessary. And then the other thing I would say that I think is really important is it completely depends on where the young scholar is being trained. Because for instance, in anthropology right now in the United States, in my department, which is a very theoretical department, if someone interviewed for a job and they had worked on a larger project, like they were trained in a multidisciplinary project and worked with their advisor, they would not get a job. And so it's really important to think about how people can get trained and then go on and get a job. One of my interests is trying to change anthropology to say, could we train grad students to work on collaborative projects from the time they got to grad school? But that's changing the ecology radically. And would it be possible for epidemiology students to work with, anthropologists? And you probably have stuff to say too.
Very quickly, I think that we're very excited about the Exposum Symposium next week, because one of the attendees will be the director of National Institute of Environmental Health Science. And we want to present our work because NIH would never give us funds for this work, never, because we don't have a hypothesis. And I think that it's worthwhile to think differently. So I hope that we succeed. Next week we will have a panel. But yeah, I think that Antonio has a really good comment. Antonio is the one who talked about the results from water. Y lo que él dice es que los resultados se tienen que contextualizar para no perder interpretación. Y yo ahí sí quiero comentar que, por supuesto, Antonio, tienes toda la razón. No profundizamos en la interpretación de los resultados porque lo que queríamos era profundizar en los métodos, ¿no? Por eso tampoco profundizamos en cómo medimos calidad del agua, etcétera. Y bueno, respondiendo a la pregunta de si necesitan saber de las dos, yo creo que no. Yo creo que no. La mujer del vestido naranja en la foto del lado derecho es la ingeniera. La mujer con la que estoy viendo la computadora es bioestadística, es Brisa Sánchez. Aquí tenemos la güera del lado derecho, es un estudiante de ciencias políticas, luego un ingeniero. Lisa, por ahí debes estar, ahí está José Luis arriba, que es economista, otro ingeniero por allá. No, creo que lo que nosotros decimos es no necesitamos saber hacer todo, al contrario, hay que reconocer que no sabemos hacer todo, que no podemos y que nos enriquecemos de la conversación, ¿no? Socorro. Es tu turno.
Yeah, bueno, thanks so much for your talk, both of you, for all the work you've done. It's amazing. So congratulations. I just want to say 2 comments and just 1 question. Well, first comment, I'm very fond of Ann Arbor. I studied at the U of M, my master's degree, but while there, my daughter was born and now she's a physician working at the University of Washington.
Oh.
But that gives me a very good perspective of how you think. And I really would encourage many people like you yourself that were so fearless to go and live in such a different environment and get all of this data for us in the world, along with Mara and the rest of the team. So that's great. The other thing is that I worked with Dr. Walter Willett and people here developing the food frequency questionnaire, and I'm very aware of those, disadvantages. And exactly, we were trying to work with a casserole and give the ingredients and the, food value. It was so different because exactly, people cannot think like that. So it's amazing what you found in this diet study. And I agree, I totally agree with you. My second comment is about something that hasn't been said here. You know that we have many graduate programs here at the School of Public Health. And for our Masters in Public Health students, we do this kind of work, like in a very limited capacity, not like in the broad way that you did it. But it has been amazing that for many generations, people who are trained to be epidemiologists work with the social sciences people, and they have been doing this public health, diagnosis for many counties here in Morelos. So it has been very useful for them to realize that also social sciences methods can work along with the epidemiological methods. But I think in a very small scale, but it works. And this kind of thing should be taught to them, because they will realize how good it is for them to conduct this type of studies every generation. And we have done that for many years. So I think this really sets the goal and the mark for our MPH students. That's very interesting. And the last thing, just one question is, well, I will have many questions. And how are you going to work with the first cohort that now have even grandkids? It's amazing that how could you relate all this information from one generation to the other, especially in the neurobehavioral, measurements. What did happen with those kids that were prevented from being contaminated with the lead, during pregnancy or after pregnancy? That will be one thing that will be amazing. I don't know which are your plans for that, but especially the last comment is about my question about the water, because it's so important, and around the world we're, missing all this vital liquid. And I don't know, how are you trying to influence the public health policy and its impact on health? Because specifically in Mexico and in the Nutrition Center, they have been trying to make people drink less soda, and they haven't been able to do exactly for all the things that you were explaining. So how could you envision along the team, how could you impact those public policy, things among Mexicans, since we are so fond of sodas, for example? Because I have many questions, but just trying to narrow those down.
It seems like there's two. So there's one about water, and then there's one about the F2s. So do you want to do that first, or should I do water? So the trying to influence public policy, in some ways you have the people right here that hopefully are going to do it. We have the first Jose Luis, we have our first piece coming out that's just the descriptives of water intermittency that's coming out in Salud Pública in like a month, right? And it'll cover those descriptive kind of characteristics of intermittency. And we're working on another, Jose Luis is doing most of the work along with Alejandra. The second paper will be about the relationship of intermittency to inequality in some really interesting ways. But we have a series of papers planned just for this first year. And then we hope to go on continuing to, analyze the data in a somewhat longitudinal way, we would hope. But we have to find some funds for that. So I think that's like just getting it on the agenda is the first thing. But then, and this is just me, they can have their own answers. I think for me, the two main things to think about are, how can you move the attention away from individual behavior to more structural kinds of interventions? So the billboards telling people not to drink soda might not do that much, except it might increase class distinctions, because the people that can drink water do, and then feel judgmental of the people that keep drinking soda. And I think looking at the larger structures, which all of you know how to do here, at like, why is soda so cheap is like a number one thing, although that's a hard question, because there's reasons there's governance subsidies for Coca-Cola and the aquifer. There are reasons for that are hugely political, and it's very hard to change that. But it's maybe about putting less of the resources on billboards and more resources in thinking about those kinds of things. But I think a really practical, potentially practical thing that we've been talking about is, would there be a way to get water services to imagine itself as not ending the grid at the point of the household? Like, could the grid go inside the household? If there were ways, and it turns out there are, that you could have filters at kitchen sinks that filtered the water, which a lot of middle to upper class people have, but that it was a government contract to service, would that be a way that it would be more appealing for people to turn on the tap? And I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in working class homes about filters. Filters, you have to replace the little thing every 3 months. They're expensive. But if this was something that came with SACMEX, that there was the filter after the water was in the tinaco, and someone showed up in your house, just like changing out the gas, and they changed the filter and did some testing, and you knew that that water was actually good quality, it feels like that would go a long way to changing the sets of relationships that make it so it doesn't make sense to turn on the tap and drink that water. So that could, and it just seems like, could we pilot that? Would that be an interesting way to think about changing the conditions of like tap water quality? That doesn't change intermittency, but it changes the way people adapt to intermittency. And given that more of us are going to have intermittency, that might be one of the solutions, or an interesting solution to think about. Oh, you have a...
Sobre lo del FFQ, híjole, mira, yo creo que el FFQ nos ha dado información muy valiosa de la que hemos aprendido muchísimo, pero creo que también ahora lo vería con un poco más de cuestionamiento, y a lo mejor si la pregunta es ¿qué? A grandes rasgos podemos entender qué está comiendo la gente, pero si queremos entender el por qué, creo que nos estamos quedando cortos. Entonces, por ejemplo, ahorita estamos muy orgullosos porque estamos midiendo metales en alimentos y vamos a poder estimar cuánto cadmio entra a la dieta por... Yo creo que eso lo vamos a poder hacer muy bien con el FFQ, o plomo, o arsénico, o mercurio. Lo vamos a poder hacer muy bien. Entonces, yo creo que eso se puede. Va a ser una medición imprecisa. No quiero quitarle el valor al FFQ de ninguna manera. Nosotros de veras hemos aprendido mucho. Pero también creo que, por ejemplo, las observaciones de Lisa, donde los participantes ya entendieron que no deben tomar refresco y llegan y dicen que no toman refresco. Y ella está viendo que esconden el refresco en botellas de agua con refresco de limón y lo mandan a la escuela, una botella de agua marca no sé qué, ¿no es cierto? O saben que no deben usar barro vidrio con plomo y nos dicen que no están consumiendo en barro vidrio con plomo. O sea, yo creo que eso es lo que también hemos aprendido, a cuestionar un poco el instrumento. ¿Algo? José Luis, ¿tú? ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Tienes como 3 más.
3 más. Oye, qué maravilla. Es que además han sido resistentes, ya vamos más de 2 horas. Qué padre. Kirvis. Ay, Kirvis, qué bueno que te conectaste. Muchas gracias por el excelente seminario y conversatorio. En los últimos años ha tomado relevancia el desarrollo de proyectos de investigación con metodología mixta en qué se diferencia con los estudios híbridos, que también se mencionan en la actualidad. ¿Son símiles? Lisa, ¿tú sabes a qué se le llaman estudios híbridos? No. ¿No? Quizá yo puedo comentar un poco, ahora que nos pidieron para hacer la propuesta de la unidad didáctica de métodos mixtos, sí me llama mucho la atención que cuando se habla de métodos mixtos, poco se incluye la etnografía, si es que no se incluye. O sea, lo común es que digan, vamos a hacer esto cuantitativo y vamos a hacer grupos focales para complementar la información, para explicar la información. Y si no son grupos focales, entrevistas semi-estructuradas. No sé, Kirvis, si a eso te refieres con estudios híbridos. Creemos que lo novedoso en particular de esta metodología mixta es que es con etnografía, que si es como el extremo de lo cualitativo. Kirvis, a lo mejor podrías decirnos a qué te refieres con híbrido, porque no conocemos ese término. Mientras Kirvis nos contesta, Alejandra Rodríguez pregunta, ¿cuál ha sido uno de los mayores retos en los proyectos al momento de utilizar ambas metodologías y cómo lo resolvieron? Bueno, si quieres yo contesto esta, Lisa, del cuál ha sido los mayores retos. El primero que nada, la comunicación. O sea, cuando alguien dice una palabra, hay todo un concepto atrás en cada persona. Entonces, Lisa y yo hemos pasado por momentos en que casi nos aventamos un jitomate en la cabeza porque estamos usando la misma palabra para cosas muy diferentes. Venimos de backgrounds muy diferentes. Entonces, es todo un reto comunicarse y encontrar ese lenguaje común. Lo que decías de Element, la verdad es que tomó muchos años, mucha paciencia, mucha perseverancia hasta que empezó a poder hasta darse esa comunicación. Entonces, ese ha sido un reto. Y el otro enorme es el financiamiento. O sea, el financiamiento ha sido un reto enorme. Gracias al The National Science Foundation fue clave. Este de Ensanut es un poco más chiquito, pero nuestro reto es el siguiente financiamiento. Y es muy difícil. Sí, nuestra tasa de éxito ha sido baja. Por ejemplo, en NIH, Lisa, Brisa y yo pensamos que propusimos algo muy bonito para entender obesidad en México y con las cortes, entendiendo de una manera como más integral la actividad física, la obesidad, y no pasamos ni la revisión. Cuando ni siquiera nos dieron score. Cuando la verdad es que la historia de las cortes nos ha ido muy bien en financiamiento y creemos que no pudimos comunicarnos. O sea, ese reto de comunicarse con el revisor es inmenso. Creo que eso serían como, no sé, mejor en publicación, hasta eso. Y bueno, si alguien quiere leer un precioso artículo, lean un artículo de Lisa que se llama How to Make Better Numbers. Es Making Better Numbers. Si quien quiera, escríbame y se lo comparto. Es un precioso artículo que Lisa escribió de todo esto. Me brinqué una pregunta. A ver. Bueno, déjame leer este. David, about water theme, it would be interesting to identify key people related to water, such as plumbers or water truck drivers, and ask them about common practices about household water supply, like milking water. Yo creo que es una muy buena idea que podemos explorar, cómo no. Eric Monterrubio, excelente presentación, felicidades. ¿Podrían decir que han realizado un ejercicio de interdisciplina? Yo creo que sí, creo que sí, Eric, creo que sí. Gracias por la pregunta, pero creo que sí. Por eso te costó tanto trabajo decir el nombre del proyecto, Sociotecno. Ese es nuestro. No creo que ya no nos falta ninguno. ¿Algo de hipótesis? Ya. ¿Cómo se hizo la selección de la? ¿Otra pregunta aquí? Claro, adelante, gracias.
Yo tengo dos preguntas. Uno es un poquito en ese artículo que menciona de How to Make Better Numbers. Yo lo entiendo como que podría convertirse la investigación antropológica como en otra manera de validación, porque pues como se menciona, ¿no? Que uno puede ser, o es evidente que existe sesgo de deseabilidad social en lo que reportan los participantes, ¿no? En los estudios. Y bueno, esa es la pregunta de si se podría quizás en un futuro cercano convertirse la antropología en una forma de validación, ¿no? De los instrumentos. Y la segunda pregunta es, ¿cuál es cómo entienden el concepto de etnografía? Porque en la palabra, pues yo encuentro, o cuando escucho grafía, me imagino scatter plots o box plots, pero no vi aquí nada de eso, ¿no? ¿Cómo se podría entender? O sea, creo que lo internalizo con todo lo que nos han platicado como un tipo de investigación antropológica. Pero, what is the main idea?
Okay. So, I mean, what you learn the first day in an anthropology class is ethnography means writing. So graph, you have graphs, but graph means writing, like a graphic expression. So it's like writing about ethnos, writing about people in their worlds. And this was coined at a time when there was a lot of interest in ethnicity as things that were different that you would write about. So that was what ethnography was. Anthropology was the study of man in all of man's complexity, and ethnography is writing about culture in a way, except so many of us don't really even like the word culture so much anymore. But it's a process of observing and writing. So the phrase that gets used a lot is participant observation. So you're participating and you're observing and writing about it at the same time. And you're participating in whatever it is people are doing. Does that help with like what it is? Okay. And then the first question was about validation. And I think, but maybe I didn't fully understand, but would you use ethnography to validate a larger study? Is that what, like a quantitative study, an instrument? So would you use, so in many ways, I don't think that's done very often, but when Mara was talking about these NIH that we tried to get, but we failed, and someday we're going to figure out this, what we did was we proposed this kind of complex methodology where we would do ethnography with a whole bunch of ethnographers, and they would kind of cross-validate each other. We would design surveys, and then we would see once we put them into motion if they kind of matched up with what the ethnographers thought about what was really going on. So there were forms of validation. And I think that there's all kinds of ways that could be used, but it hasn't really been put to the test, mostly because I would say when ethnographers tend to get used in these quantitative fields, they're usually not letting the ethnographer do the open-ended thing first. And I think if we had more space to do the open-ended thing, to generate the good hypothesis, then do the quantitative large-scale work, and bring it back, I think that there's a kind of validity there that could happen. But I'll tell you about a different kind of validity, I think that happens all the time for ethnographers, that is hugely meaningful, at least. So when I'm an anthropologist, as myself or in this work that we've been doing, when you give talks to people, so I used to work in Ecuador, and I would give talks about reproduction in Ecuador, and I gave talks in Ecuador and people would say, you got it right. I never thought to say it that way. If you had asked me on a survey, I wouldn't have been able to answer that. But, oh, you just described something that I hadn't thought about. That is also a very powerful form of validation. And when I've given talks to the staff at La Casita in Element about soda and water, and they're mostly from similar neighborhoods, they'll say like, oh, we knew this all the time, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to turn what they know into questions. So I think that there's like survey questions. So I think there's a kind of validity that happens in that way as well. You probably have more.
A mí me gusta mucho tu pregunta porque retoma la reflexión que dejaba, ¿no? ¿Qué significa validez? Y yo creo que la etnografía tiene un rol muy importante para definir validez. Creo que mi reflexión es que si me pidieran validar un instrumento, no podría, que se le va a aplicar a personas, creo que no podría hacerlo sin un componente etnográfico. Pero gracias por la pregunta. ¿Alguien más? Adelante.
Impresionante. Ustedes tienen un ejemplo.
Y nosotros también.
Ya, es como...
Y muy buenas tardes. Gracias por las dos presentaciones de los 3 estudios. Muy interesante la financiación, el sostenimiento en el tiempo y la herencia de los participantes. Mi pregunta va dirigida a lo siguiente, y es que uno como observador, cuando se incluye dentro de la investigación, pues siempre va a tener un sesgo, y es el sesgo de la observación. ¿Cómo lograron ustedes controlar ese sesgo de observación?
If you want me, Yo no fui quien estuvo ahí, pero ¿sabes por qué? Yo creo que no hay sesgo de observación porque se metió a la vida de las familias. O sea, desafortunadamente no se pudieron ver las fotos, pero hay por ahí una foto de Lisa haciendo comida con las participantes. O sea, es que iba a la iglesia, estaba en las fiestas de 15 años, dejó de ser observadora para ser parte de la vida. O sea, ella vivió 6 meses con cada familia. Entonces, dejó de ser observadora y creo que hasta la fecha, cuando vienes a México, vas a visitar a tus familias y les traes regalos. O sea, se volvió parte dejó de ser observadora. Pero todo esto fue con consentimiento informado, ¿eh? Sí, creo que esa sería, y si me dices cómo lo pudimos validar lo que te estoy diciendo, no. Pero es como yo interpreto. Adelante.
Bueno, a mí me gustaría complementar un poco la respuesta.
Sí.
Yo soy antropóloga y quizás, sí, y quizás pueda también ayudar a comprender que desde el método de la etnografía tenemos 2 perspectivas interesantes, que es la perspectiva EMIC y la perspectiva ETIC, es decir, la perspectiva del participante, pero también la perspectiva del investigador. Y justo en este ejercicio de etnografía muy completo que nos presentó, se integran estas 2 perspectivas y a partir de esto surge el análisis y la comprensión del estilo de vida, de los comportamientos, de los significados, todo lo que pudo identificar que a lo mejor en el momento en el que se integró a una familia no estaba explícita esa diversidad de formas de cocinar o esa diversidad de formas de vivir entre familias, pero sí es posible captarlas e integrarlas una vez ya procesada la información. Solo eso.
Gracias, y qué maravilla que se... Digo,
gracias.
No, pues, gracias a ti. Ah, claro. Hay 2 preguntas. Adelante.
I have a mixed question, Dr. Roberts. In epidemiologic studies, oftentimes one of the desired results is that they are in fact valid enough so that you could generalize them to a larger population or extrapolate them as such. Do you think that implementing mixed methods could actually counter that idea, or maybe have the opposite effect in the sense that it could actually increase generalizability of the results?
Yes. Let's see. So I think that the experience of doing this and the few other ethnographers that I know who do work in teams, I've told you, I've sent you, there's, for instance, ethnographer, his name is Philippe Bourgois, and he does a lot of work with epidemiologists about drug use in the United States. And I think he and his team have shown over and over again that, again, if you kind of have a more ethnographic sense, you can kind of ask these questions that get you to more generalizability within specific groups. So what ethnography is really good at doing is, I think, showing when there's too much generalizing going on. Like if we think about the sleep study, like if you just do a study in middle-class people in the United States, it seems like what happens often is the finding that, oh, it's good to sleep alone, or you should go to bed by a certain time and turn off the lights. That gets extrapolated to everyone. But what anthropology and ethnography is really good at doing is saying that might not be true for everyone, even in the United States. Like there's all kinds of people that share bedrooms, and the ecology of how people sleep matters in terms of the quality of their sleep. And it's not universally the same for everyone. So I think I'm answering your second question, but I think I should try to understand better the first question like that you asked.
Maybe what I was trying to say is that as opposed to thinking of a whole population, it would be somewhat more reasonable to think of several subpopulations that make a whole. And the way I see it is, with the insights you have provided today, it's very likely that it could actually be more productive to look at it that way, as opposed to be thinking of everybody as homogeneous, so to say. And we should actually be thinking, maybe revert that way of thinking and actually start accepting the fact that populations are just that, very heterogeneous groups of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ethnography is often, the folks that collaborate with epidemiologists are often pushing against this idea of a population itself, like what is constituting a population. And we can obviously say there is a population in Mexico, like we count them, like there's this many people in Mexico, but to think that they're all the same, and that you could apply a survey and it will all mean this. So actually, I think we have a good example from what happened with the HYs and the Ensanut. So the thing about anger. So we were in a meeting with the people that, we were in a meeting on Zoom with the people who developed this HY survey that is supposed to be universally validated. Supposedly you can go anywhere in the world and ask these 10 questions about water insecurity, and then you can come up with a score. Like, does this individual have water insecurity, and does this population have water insecurity? And they've used it on the Ensanut. So we were already a bit skeptical of the HYs because they found that only 20% or less of people in Mexico have water insecurity. But we found all this intermittency, and we think ethnographically, we have a pretty good sense why, which is they're asking people about feelings, like, are you ashamed or angry about your water? And we know that women have a lot of pride in how well they manage their water. So they're not going to say they're angry. So that is going to not really accurately measure the experience of not having water. Okay. So we already went into the meeting feeling kind of like, this is not a very good validation. But then when we were in the meeting, it got even more severe, where the woman who created this measure wanted the Mexican researchers who applied it to, is it the word validate or standardize the way they ask the survey. And she was saying to them, you have to use the word enojar in rural and urban areas. And the Mexican researchers were saying, enojo in rural areas in the South does not mean the same thing as enojo in Mexico City. And if you ask this in a standardized way, you are not going to get answers about a reality you care about. You're going to get answers. There will be data. You will have data. But what people meant when they answered those questions really is different in rural Oaxaca versus, Barrio Norte in Mexico City, and where? And in Tijuana. They mean different things, and it doesn't work to ask the same question in the same exact way. And so I think that's what you came away from that meeting saying, oh, standardization is a very complex thing. And I think that's what you're getting at in this question. And I think one of the reason anthropologists are often skeptical of numbers is those are the kinds of reductions that happen, that go into making those numbers. And then policy is made and things happen that are very powerful. And, I think that there's a way that we can make better numbers by doing this kind of mixed methods research. Eso. Other questions? No.
Creo que Kirvis comentó, gracias Kirvis por tener esta conversación, dice, muchas gracias. En ciencias de la implementación se habla de estudios híbridos y por lo que he podido revisar implica la utilización de métodos mixtos, incluida la etnografía, y por ello preguntaba si serían similares al contexto de la epidemiología. Fíjate que creo que esta pregunta se sale de lo que hemos trabajado en ciencias de la implementación. La verdad es que creo que no tendríamos una muy buena respuesta aquí, viste, la debemos. Oigan, pues muchas gracias por venir. Si les gustó el tema, hay un seminario que aquí dio Anita Hardon en enero. Ella es de Países Bajos y dio un precioso seminario, ese nada más duró 1 hora, de métodos mixtos, y habló en particular de un ejercicio que ella hizo en Filipinas para entender el uso de cremas blanqueadoras en trabajadoras sexuales en Indonesia. Híjole, qué bonito seminario. Sí, de servicio y de trabajadoras sexuales. Se los recomiendo mucho, está en el repositorio. Pues muchas gracias por venir. Tona, qué bueno que no te tuviste que ir. Muchas gracias. Gracias a todas y a todos. Y gracias a los valientes y las valientes que estuvieron remotamente todo este tiempo. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.